us in Times Square, which was really super cool. And then we started talking more and more, and we thought if we want to learn about how to add security into DevOps, we should probably find new ways. So one way is to make insecure examples and learn from that. And then another way is to create secure Times Square, which is really super cool. And then we started talking more and more, and we thought if you want to learn about she added a DevSecOps pipeline, oh, stuff's happening. Hi, this is me. Okay, great. We should probably find new. I guess they're going to stream my feed, and I'm going to share examples and learn from that. Their feed later. And then another way is to create. I'm going to minimize this. And okay, great. Okay, hi everyone. You should probably I'm Tanya Jacob. They're going to stream my feed, and I'm going to share examples and their feed later. And then another way is to create. I'm going to minimize this and a lot of nerdy things. I'm part of the OWASP DevSecOps project. And today I want to talk about if you're ready for the worst. And personally, I think instant response is the worst. Okay, great. Okay, hi everyone. You should probably I'm Tanya Jacob. They're going to stream my feed, and I'm going to share examples and their feed later. And so it feels like you're doing Microsoft and a lot of nerdy things. I'm part of but I also thought your project stressful, especially if I want to talk about if you're ready for the worst and no one else. And personally, I think instant response is the worst. Okay, great. Okay, hi everyone. You should probably I'm Tanya. Especially if I want to talk about if you're ready for the worst and no one else. And personally, I think if someone's responding to our database. Okay, great. Hi, everything. Probably ruined our app or broken it or done something to it that we weren't expecting. They have no idea where to start. Yeah. Okay. So, what are we going to talk about today? So we are going to talk about preparing for an incident. And this is going to be at least 80 or 90% of the talk. Because if we have prepared well, we will have less incidents. And when we have an incident, it will be short and sweet. And then two, we're going to talk about during an incident, what do you do? Okay. So first of all, this is me. I'm Tanya Janka. I'm a big nerd. And on the internet, I'm called She Has Purple because I am a purple teamer. So I'm not red team, as in attacking, I'm not blue team, like defending. I tend to do both, hence the purple. And then I work for a little startup. You might have heard of us before. And I have a very strange job. I'm Tanya Janka. I do developer relations. I advocate on behalf of software developers in regards to security. So I made a slide to explain what that means because everyone's always like, I don't understand what your job is. Hence the purple. So I get feedback from the community and get them to change things so that it's better. And I have a very strange job. I do security research, I release it, I create content on how to do things. A bunch of people ask me all the same questions. So how do I do this? To explain it, then I probably should make a video or write a blog post or something like that. And then I get to do cool things like speak at community events. So hi everyone, thanks for coming. Thank you everyone in Vancouver. I'm sorry I can't physically be there. I'm on the island right next to you in Victoria. Some things came up and yeah, how do I do this? Okay, so I consider myself an application security evangelist, and I'm not like this guy. I am just like this guy with all the happy. So hi everyone, thanks for coming. Around me. Thank you everyone in Vancouver. I'm sorry I can't totally obsessed be there. I'm on the island right next to the Open Web Application Security Project. I realize that you are at an OWASP meeting right now, but sometimes people don't realize. So I consider myself. We do so many things. I'm part of the Ottawa chapter. I'm one of their leaders, and then I'm also part of a project, the DevSecOps project. Thank you, everyone. You can see the little purple Care Bear there. I feel that we are the Care Bears of security, trying to help everyone in the entire world make applications that are more secure. Yeah, we're thousands of volunteers. We make software, we write books, everything's free because we really want the internet to be a safer place. I helped start a meetup in Ottawa called WIST, Women in Security and Technology. We have chapters all over. Yeah, and it's a meetup for women in security to like do cool stuff. We crash meetups together, give each other workshops, help each other find mentors and jobs, things like that. So if you're a woman and you want to join, let me know because we definitely want you. So I've been a nerd like a really long time. And basically, my whole goal and the reason why I do these things is because I feel that security is too hard, especially for developers. It's ridiculous. I feel like you have to do 10,000 extra steps to try to make something secure, and I want to change the way our industry does things so the default of everything is secure. And if you want to make something insecure, you have to work really hard at it. So that is one of my personal career goals. But with that, that's like a lot of stuff about me, but that's not what you came here for. You came here for incident response. So first, I'm gonna start with a couple. Earlier you are in the system development lifecycle, right? So if we start security at the beginning and do it the whole way through, that would be shifting left, right? The earlier you start security, the more you're shifting left. And I say pushing left because sometimes I'm not invited. But we definitely need to start security at the beginning. So it means doing security from the start and the whole way through. So pushing right is a thing that I have started saying affectionately. So I've done a lot of incident response. I get invited in at the end a lot because the first time they're looking at security is when something awful has happened, right? And so they do it there after the release when it's just the worst possible time to do it. So a security incident is the most expensive, embarrassing, and damaging situation to deal with a security problem or a vulnerability. It's humiliating, it ruins your reputation as a company, it's costly, it takes time to recover, and it's much, much, much less expensive to push left and deal with security problems earlier on. So sometimes I'll affectionately say, oh, they're really pushing right because they're just doing nothing for security and they're just crossing their fingers. That's their entire risk management plan. And obviously that's bad. Okay, so now like what is a security incident and what is a security event? Because they're definitely different. So a security incident or a security event is when something's happened, but you don't know if something bad has happened. So you're suspecting something's wrong, you're not sure if it's related to security, it's something you have to go check out. And then a security incident is when something for sure has happened that's bad. And either it has happened or it is happening, but you are certain something is bad. So, an example, if you find your company's data for sale on the dark web, you have a security incident. That's definitely an incident. That's definitely bad. Yeah. Okay. So throughout this talk, I might say IR or incident response. So incident response is an organized approach to addressing and managing the aftermath of a security breach or IT incident. So the goal is to handle the situation, trying to limit the damage and reduce the recovery time and the costs. So that the idea is being organized, making things go back to the way they were as soon as possible, recovering, fixing, and then figuring out what happened and making sure it never happens again. But we're going to talk about that. Okay, so what is AppSec or application security? So any activity that you do in efforts to push left or in efforts to secure your application is part of application security. So if you do a penetration test, a secure code review, if you run a bunch of security scanning tools on your software, that's AppSec. But other things, for instance, upgrading your framework because you know there's a known vulnerability that's really bad and you don't want your app to be vulnerable to that. Or for instance, let's say if you were going to grep through your source code looking for a function that you know is no longer really very secure and there's something out that's better and you want to replace it, all of those things are considered part of application security. So when I say AppSec, I mean any type of activity like that, whether it's formal or not. Okay, so application security is a problem. For 2016 and 2017, application security issues were the number one thing that caused breaches, which is obviously very bad. according to the Verizon breach report. And then application security as a topic is hardly ever or not at all covered in school, meaning developers get out of school and they have no training in this, and then security teams quite often don't have any training on it, and then they're all just winging it and doing their best. And so we end up having, like, when we have an incident, sometimes it's really, really, truly awful because we're just so unprepared for it. Okay, so now the talk is starting. Enough of the beginning of the talk. Let's talk about preparing for an incident and doing all sorts of things to ensure we don't have an incident. And then we're going to talk about during an incident. So my tagline here is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Definitely an ounce of AppSec costs several pounds of incident response. Okay, so let's start. Okay, so first of all, I'm gonna give you just a would you use, there's probably a framework. If you have to update .NET from 4.5 to 4.6, that's really easy. But if you have to do it from 2.0 to 4.7, that's a rewrite. So if you can keep upgrading regularly, it's so much cheaper and it will be much, much, much more secure. And then patch your servers. I know that servers don't seem like an application security problem, but I mean, if they can get into your app via your server, you're still in trouble. So this is the most obvious advice ever. Please, please, please do it. And then I have this is fine, but it's not really fine. This is what I look like when I'm managing an incident. I'm like, don't worry, everyone, I've got it. I know the world's burning around me, but we got this, we can do it. I realize that in a lot of organizations, this is really difficult. And this is why we created DevOps. And this is why we've started doing site reliability engineering and started doing operations in new ways. So if your organization is having problems keeping up with patching and like keeping your frameworks up to date, you might want to examine like your whole structure around doing IT. Because a lot of people are like, well, it's impossible where I work. So then maybe that's the thing you need to look at. But that is another topic I like to talk about, which I'm not talking about here. Okay, next. So yeah, it's not fine. Okay, so incident response process for your organization. So your organization should have a process. I'm just gonna check to see yeah. Okay, great. I'm just checking to see if anyone's asking questions. Okay, I've worked at a few places where well, one place in particular where I got there and the previous incident manager showed me this really awesome looking incident response process. They had it approved. It was really cool, but they had not showed it to anyone else. So the first time we had an incident, no one followed it because they'd never heard of it, and they ruined the chain of custody. All sorts of bad things happened. And so the most important thing about your incident response process is to create it and then tell every single person you work with about it. So tell them what their role is and what you expect from them. So if they're help desk, maybe their role is just to call you. Or if it's a developer, maybe, if the incident has to do with their application, don't go home till you've talked to us, because maybe we're going to have questions. We are definitely going to have questions for you. And like, what should management do? Sometimes management's most important role is making sure everyone remains calm. You need to train people regularly about the response you expect from them so they know. I've definitely had a help desk person try to be a hero and fix it themselves, and they ended up scaring the crap out of everyone ever because they're telling everyone, and it turned out there wasn't even a security problem happening. It was just bad latency. And but they caused like quite a scare for everyone by not following the process because my team had not trained them properly. So that was us, not that help desk person trying to do the best job they could. So I would suggest that giving people a refresher once a year I think most places should do security training once a year, especially if you have specialized roles. So if you're a sysadmin, if you're a developer, help desk, there's probably special security training that you need. And so if you're refreshing everyone on this once a year, you can make this part of the training. Everyone needs to know who to call, so you should have one phone number. It should not be a switching phone number. They should not have to remember, oh, it's Tanya's turn, it's Ed's turn, it's Jen's turn. There should just be one number. And every single person in IT has a job, and a lot of them, their job is don't touch anything and call us, please. And letting them know that they can trust you, you're not going to yell at them, and you're going to help them, it's pretty important. Okay, so instant response. So why create your own process when you can copy really awesome ones? So SANS has one that's great. NIST has one that's great. I think I'm going to share a whole bunch of different resources throughout this talk. So if you want to, you can just take a screenshot of this, or you can watch the recording later. Okay, so next. So if you have a security team and you expect them to respond to incidents, they need training. So every single person on your security team ideally would have incident management training, because you can't have one incident manager, because that means if your incident manager gets sick, is tired, or whatever, like you can only manage an incident for so many hours straight, and then you're not doing a good job anymore. And so you want to definitely have 2 or more. You would want them to have forensics training. You'd want them to practice doing red team and blue team exercises. You would want them to simulate incidents so that they could practice. You would want to do detection, monitoring, more. I guess the point I'm trying to make on this slide is that if you plan to have an in-house incident response team, it's going to cost you money. And I've worked at places where we have one, and that's great. And then I've worked at places where the incident response team is one person who can wipe computers and reinstall them, and then they call out if it's more serious than that. And that is an absolutely acceptable plan and way to do it, is just knowing when you need to call for help, because it's quite costly to have an incident response team that's fully trained. But assuming you're going to have one because you work at a place that is not for people, you work at a big company. Oh, yeah. So Nmap is your friend. Nmap's my friend. Every security person, it is your friend. So basically, the first thing you want to do once everyone's had some training and you know everyone knows how to manage an incident and you have a process, you need to figure out what you're protecting. And that's why Nmap is your friend. So if you are in the cloud, this is slightly different because you can just look in your subscription and you should be able to see everything. But if you're in a traditional data center, you might not know all the things that you have. And so you want to use Nmap to make sure, just basically do a discovery scan of everything. If port 443 or port 80 are open, it's probably a web server. You might want to visit it. Many times I've been in an incident and people are telling me about an app that's down. I had no idea I was supposed to be protecting something there. Obviously that's not good. So having an inventory is the best thing ever. So you want to make the most valuable Excel spreadsheet known to man. And you want to put all of this stuff in there, and have it run Nmap a lot. And if you can have it like auto update, this would be really great, but you need to know what you're protecting or you can't protect it. So application inventory and discovery. I should warn you that if you have not done this before, you probably have 30% more applications than you realized, and that'll be fun to find out. Yeah, okay. So if you're in the cloud, Nmap's unnecessary because they will do, the cloud provider should do this for you. Okay, so up next. So you can't protect it if you're not aware that you have it, right? So you need to document your tech stack. What programming languages does your office use? So I've worked at places where all we do is Java, or all we do is .NET. But then I've worked at places where their tech stack is like a wild safari of like everything you could possibly think of, like stuff that I've never even heard of before. And like I've worked in tech a long time, and if someone's coming out with things I haven't heard of, it's usually like pretty scary. So programming languages, APIs, frameworks, libraries, Which operating systems do you run on your servers? Do you only run Windows? Do you only run Linux? Do you run 500 different flavors of Linux? You probably do. What configurations do you have? Do you have a standardization on configurations? Are people keeping to the standardization? Ugh. You'd want to know about your firewalls, what's open, what's closed, inputs and outputs and integrations between different systems. This is going to seem really daunting, but if you know, for instance, like we're a Ruby house, that's all we do, or Ruby shop, then that means that's all you need to pay attention to, right? But if you have a bunch of .NET apps as well, you need to pay attention to that as well. You can save yourself a lot of time if you know for sure what you have and what you don't have. Okay, enough of a lecture on this. Okay. Oh, and you can use tools like Dependency Check or Sneak, Black Duck. I think Synopsys makes, Sonatype makes something, Weight Source Bolt. There's a whole bunch of tools that you can use that I think you should use to scan your code, and it will tell you all the different libraries and other things that you're using, and it will just give you a summary of many of these things, not all of them, but it'll tell you what things are out of date and insecure and suggest options. But more importantly, in regards to this specifically, is it'll just let you know what you have, so you don't have to manually go look for it, so it could save you a lot of time. Next, you want to stay informed about what's going on. So you want to know about threats. So if you can afford a threat feed, you should get one. Or if you work at a place like I do, that little startup, Microsoft, we create our own threat feed because we're pretty big. But you can buy a threat feed from various companies. CSIRC, so that's from Canada, we have an RRS feed, and we also have security bulletins and technical reports, and all of it's free and open to the public, and it's not necessarily Canadian specific. And I know the American government does this, and I'm pretty sure that the European Union does this as well. So depending upon where you are in the world, there's options for you, but we are in Canada, this meetup, so you'd probably want to check out CSIRC. Okay, so there's the US cert. Someone else was telling me you could use Swamp in a Box, which is free. I have not tried it, so I can't tell you that it's good, but I've definitely used the CSIRC stuff, and it's good. Okay, threats number 2, more. So there's a lot of different interesting ways that you can sign up to learn more about what's going on. So CVE details, so you can sign up to find out when new CVEs come out, but CVEs are pretty late. Listen to podcasts, monitor Twitter. A lot of companies have alerts set up in Google and Twitter and other social medias for the name of their company, and then down, hacked, breach. I know that that sounds really low tech, but it works. It works really fast. Like WannaCry spilled out onto Twitter way before anyone got alerts in any of these feeds. So keeping track of those things are a good way to learn about stuff. Sign up for security updates on your entire tech stack. So if you use .NET, sign up for our stuff. If you use Ruby, Python, all of those things, WordPress has a security feed, so you should sign up for it. Monitor recent breaches of other companies to see if you can learn from it. So Equifax, it was a struts problem, like a Java struts framework problem, and if you can learn from their mistake and upgrade or just switch frameworks depending upon your opinion, you could end up learning from their mistake, and that's really nice. Okay, anything else you can think of? So if there's anything you can think of, you should do it. If people are like, oh, that seems like a silly idea, but you're getting information, just do it anyway. I think you should worry less about what other people think. I've heard lots of people say, like, I'm not going to, put an alert on Twitter for the name of my company and breach. That's silly, but a lot of companies do that, and it doesn't matter if it's low tech. If it works, it works. Okay, oh, more cloud threats. So turn on threat protection. Turn on all of the security features in your cloud provider. So cloud providers are gigantor, all of them. and they have their own threat feeds that are specific to their clouds and the things that come native in their cloud. So you want to use their protection features because they are all over this. They want you to have good security experiences. So they are working extra hard to make sure things go well for you in the cloud. So turn on their security features. So threat protection, monitoring, turn on whatever security features that they offer. So if they have a dashboard, also, a thing that a lot of people forget to do, add your contact information. So your cloud provider will actually phone you if something is very bad. Make sure you set up email alerts. I know that sounds annoying, but having them call you when something goes really bad is very, 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 very valuable. But they can't do it if you haven't provided proper information. It will not protect against all application security issues, but it protects against a bunch depending upon your cloud provider, and it's totally worth doing. Okay, now let's talk about WAF, a web application firewall. So OWASP creates a free WAF called Mod Security, and then they create a rule set, which are regular expressions, like a list of signatures of bad input, and that's called the core rule set. So you can add a WAF. Let me explain what a WAF is, a web application firewall. So what is a WAF? So here's the OSI model. A traditional firewall protects on the network level, but a WAF protects at the application level. So if your application is exposed to the internet, it's not protected by a firewall. Like a firewall will protect all of the other ports, but if you have port 80 or port 443 open with your web server, or your load balancer, whatever way you're doing it, that means that part is open, and people who are using your app, if they can break into your app, let's say with an injection vulnerability or cross-site scripting getting you to run their malicious code, they can break right into your network like that. So what a WAF does is it looks at all of the requests coming to your app, and if it looks like it's malicious, it rejects it. A lot of our industry is split about a WAF because there's latency issues, and if you make the rules quite strict, that means you could potentially block legitimate business traffic, but if you make them too lax, it only blocks ridiculously obvious attacks, and so the jury's kind of out as to if people should use them or not. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. Here's why I think you should get a WAF. Okay, so this is the way I view a WAF. So it's like a shield. I think that everyone should have Mod Security running all the time because it's free, it's open source from OWASP, so that you can write signatures in it in case of emergency. So I've worked at various places. One of the places had struts, and you know, the thing that knocked down Equifax was a 0-day in struts. There were 3 0 days the same year, which made, I'm surprised all my hair is not gray. But if you have a WAF, what you can do is release a signature that looks like whatever 0-day is out there or whatever vulnerability that is in your framework is out there, and then just block any requests that look anything like that. Because generally, great big attacks don't look like normal user input. And if you just like stop those in their tracks before they even get to your application, you know, by writing this one line of code, this means that all of a sudden you're not vulnerable to a 0-day. And then that means I can sleep really well at night. Yes, that's great. So this is why I feel that everyone should have a WAF. I'm not going to talk about turning on the rest of the rules or anything like that, or commercial WAFs and how much they cost. No comment on any of that because I know our audience is really split, but I think you should have one just in case a 0-day is being exploited in the wild. There's no patch, or it's in your framework. You can't just update a framework in a few hours, especially if you have thousands of custom apps using the same framework. So a WAF can protect you in situations like that. Okay, so now let's talk about enterprise security. Just kidding. So at this point, I want to remind you that we're just talking about things that affect applications, and that I'm not covering enterprise security in this talk on purpose, or network security. So I'm not going to talk about firewalls, admin rights, lockdown, malware defenses, perimeter protections, monitoring, logging, IPS, that's intrusion prevention systems, intrusion detection systems, host intrusion prevention systems, IPS, IDS, HIPS, etc. I'm not talking about those things. I'm just talking about AppSec, and I don't want people to think like she missed some really obvious stuff. This talk would be a full day training then. Okay, So now let's talk about backups. So usually this is where I ask the audience who does backups, and then I get people to put their hands up. So think in your head if you do backups and think about it. Okay, so now who does rollbacks? Who practices rolling back their backups to make sure that they actually can access them and actually can roll them out in a realistic amount of time? There's a lot of hands go down for this one. I worked somewhere once and we lost 4 hours worth of production time on all of our apps and everything. And we asked them if they could roll back, and they explained to us it would take them at least 3 weeks to roll back. And to me, that it just blew my mind. So everyone lost a day of work, and that's extremely expensive. I think we had 2,000 employees when I worked there. That's 2,000 people having to redo their work for the day. And I know it doesn't take a whole day to read. You have to remember what you're doing, whether that be anyway, it's time consuming, extremely expensive. So if you haven't practiced rolling back your backups and you don't know if they actually work, your backups might actually be totally useless. So that is an important exercise. Another thing you're going to need is, if you're going to do instant responses, investigation tools. You need to be able to see what's happening. I've worked places where I don't have the right tools, and then it's 10 times worse than it needs to be. So I like to have a copy of Metasploit. So if there's live exploits happening in the wild at the moment, I want to go online and try to get a copy, make my own Metasploit module, and then test it in a safe environment. I do not use Metasploit on a regular basis. This is just for when there's exploits out in the wild. I want a copy of Nessus, Nexpose, OpenVAS, whatever vulnerability or VA networking infrastructure tool that you have, because they often have, they'll have a module come out just to test things that are out, and also just to see if you're vulnerable in general. I definitely always want a copy of Burp Suite Pro and OWASP Zap, so that's if it's an application problem specifically, especially if I have a copy of the attack, so I can go and try the attack and walk through and see what happens. I need log viewing software. Trying to open up a 60 gig log in Notepad is not good. Log viewing software is really important. You also need to remember that your team needs to have training, and then they need to have access. So I worked at a place once where they're like, well, you have Nessus, but there was 100 firewalls in the way, and there was no dev area where I could test or QA or safe space. And so I was like, thanks for buying me Nessus, but I can't actually use it, right? So you need to make sure that you actually have access, and then training to use these tools. Again, you can't, there's no point in buying these tools if your team doesn't know how to use them. Okay, if you use the cloud, these things are slightly different. So a lot of the cloud providers provide their own VA tools and will have their own log viewing tools. And it depends on your cloud. And I don't want to talk about each specific cloud because I only know about the one that my company makes. And so then I will only give you information on that one, and it'll be biased because I like them. So whichever cloud provider you have, you want to check out and make sure that you have log viewing software, you have access to the logs and all of that. Okay, next. What should you log? So every application should log to a centralized place, hopefully in the same format, and ideally it feeds into some sort of application SIM, or it has some sort of alerting set up. But what to log? So if you didn't log it, did it even happen? I'm just going to check to make sure there's no questions at this point, because okay, no, everything's fine. Okay, if you write custom apps, they need to do logging. Whom, so which system, which part of the system, what user caused the event, what type of event, when, so a date stamp ideally, and make sure that the timestamp is correct. I made an event for a meetup event for my meetup to invite people, and then it did it in my home time zone instead of the time zone of my computer when I made it. So I'm really sorry to people that showed up 2 hours or 3 hours early. I apologize. Meetup didn't let me choose which time zone. There's no option for me to fix it, which stinks. So which part of the app did the event occur? Was it successful, unsuccessful, and the payload? If there is something that is questionable, you want to make sure you roll back the event. that's a whole other thing. That's design, and we're not going to talk about that. But you always want to fail closed or fail safe and roll back things if there's a transaction happening or there's suspicious activity. Do not log sensitive information such as passwords, social insurance numbers, combinations that are sensitive, such as home address, name, and dates of birth. Okay, and logs need to be saved. They need to be protected, so they need to be saved to a server that is not the same as your app server, and ideally, they can be consumable by your SIEM. That's an extra step. You want to work with your security team to make sure that happens, but ideally, like, oh, it would be so beautiful if you have some sort of alerting set up on all your custom apps. Okay, so now let's talk about access. If more than once I've been at work quite late managing an incident and then realized I don't have access to things and everyone else is in bed. And then all of a sudden my incident gets a lot more complex than it needs to be. So I want to be able to see the database logs. I want to be able to see the web server logs. I need to see the source code. I'm going to need credentials to log into these things or know who I can contact to make sure I can get credentials. I need log viewing software. I need code review software. So if you write all your code in Eclipse or like Visual Studio, I need a copy of that software so that I can look at it. Opening up a 20,000 line, 400 file bit of code and then looking at it in Notepad stinks. It's awful. I need a safe place to do destructive testing. Ideally, there's an area where I can run exploits safely and see if we're vulnerable or not. Because sometimes you're not actually vulnerable and you're worrying for nothing. And everything but it really, really, really sucks to have, it's like 1 a.m. and here you are trying to test things, but then it turns out your credentials don't work anymore and they expired like 6 months ago. When an incident happens, you will be thankful you tested these things. And then documentation about where each tool is. That's important. And now on to disaster recovery. Also, yeah. So disaster recovery is having a place to recover to. We're also going to talk about BCPs, business continuity plans. So a business continuity plan is part of like regular risk management. What happens if your app goes down? Can your business still survive? How long can it survive? What do you do in case bad things happen? And are you ready? So do you have backup locations? Are your backups cold, warm, or hot? So for instance, if you have, or cloudy, so if you have a cloud provider, you can back up in the same cloud provider. You just check some boxes, or you can back up to a different cloud provider. A lot of people are doing a hybrid solution where they're using more than one cloud provider. Or if you have a traditional data center and you do everything. If you have two traditional data centers, you can have one go over to the other. Is everything off? Is everything in standby? Is everything on and hot and ready to go? This is expensive, but it is worth its weight in gold if you have a disaster. If critical infrastructure goes down, do you have a plan for that? I worked somewhere once, and our data center, the entire city went down. And so our data center went down, and we had something like 90 seconds to shut everything down. And we did surprisingly well. But what do you do from there? How long does it take you to get back up? It's a big deal when a data center goes down. Do you have cell phones? Do you have landlines? I worked somewhere once and they explained that if the internet went down, that they had mobile internet, and then they had cell phones, satellite phones, landlines, and then they actually had like a plan with physical paper. And I found it really interesting how they had backup plans. Like they had plan A, B, C, D, and then they also had like several emergency backup plans, and it was really quite incredible. They had like multiple different phone companies on purpose to make sure like if one went down, they had another one, and like they meant business. It's quite impressive. Yeah, so they had a full plan to do everything on paper. Like they actually worked, which was really quite impressive. The cloud can also help you with this, right? So if you have your own traditional data center, you could also have like a live backup in the cloud somewhere, or vice versa, because yeah, you definitely don't want to have your own backup in the same building, or ideally even in the same city, because if a huge tornado goes by, you could be in serious trouble. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about something that not everyone agrees on, but I feel that practicing for the big day is really important. So at least once per year, I think that it's highly advisable to simulate a security incident and involve multiple people so that they practice and figure out what's happening. You should tell them it's an incident. Don't scare the pants off of people for no reason. I used to work at Elections Canada, and 6 months before the election, they simulate a full entire fake election. So they actually create a place where you would go vote with all the physical machines, the network, it connects to a full dev site, everything, and they run a complete fake election. They invite a whole bunch of hackers and they throw just tons of security incidents in, and then they learn, and then they polish everything, and then when the election happened, it was smooth like butter. It was so great. We learned so much during the simulation that just things that you might not even think of, like one of the printers did really small printing and it was font size 6 or something and no one could read it, and then that was super unhelpful, so we ended up increasing the print size, which might not sound like a big thing to you, but if no one can read something that has to be read, that's completely useless, right? And it's not a thing that you want to deal with during a big event. So running an incident simulation is a really, really good idea to make sure you know what you're doing. Okay, so this is similar to the advice that you should patch everything. Scan everything ever. So get a copy, all of your apps and all your servers. I know that a lot of people will argue, scanning is not that great. It misses lots of things. Well, guess what? It finds lots of things, and it's very, very fast, right? So you can scan your whole network. You can scan all of your apps really safely, and you can do it in a day, depending. It's really also quite inexpensive because there's lots of free or very cheap tools that you can do to do this, and then fix all of those things. Because if you can scan those apps and find those things in 5 seconds, that means that a kid that has a really bad attitude that lives in his or her parents' basement that's very angry at society can also find those things. And you want to make sure that if anything's really easy to find, that it's fixed, right? Ideally, no one will hack you, but we especially want to make sure that if someone does attack you, that it's very, very, very difficult to get in. So scan everything ever. Beg people to fix what you find. This is a very valuable activity. I think everyone should do this. Okay, so I'm not talking in this talk about an AppSec program. So one of the best things you could do is launch an AppSec program, a full application formalized security program where you work with developers, you teach them, you formalize it as part of your system development lifecycle process. I'm not including that in this talk because, again, this would be multi-day training, and I was told I have an hour. So secure coding, design, threat modeling, all those things. I love talking about this. It's my favorite topic, but that's not what this talk is about, and I just wanted to remind you that's why I'm not covering it. Okay, so during an incident, what do we do now? So the first thing, I know that the past bunch of slides those were preparation before an event or incident happens, right? So once you know something is happening or you suspect something is happening, you want to immediately name an incident manager, and that person is in charge. Everyone reports to that person. They send everyone off to triage. So has something happened? What happened? Do we have any idea what's going on? I've worked at places, like once we actually had 14 minutes to triage, and then I had to brief all these executives, and we managed to solve the incident in 14 minutes. I was so impressed. It turned out, I guess I probably, because we're filming, I can't say what happened, but it turned out it was someone misusing our site in a way where they were confused and then tweeting things at us that weren't true. And we figured it all out, and then I was able to report up in a very short period of time what was wrong. And we didn't even have to do a full investigation, but just knowing like something has happened, we still suspect, we're not sure. So that's what this first step is. So then the next step is like more in depth. So usually I send everyone away for 10 minutes and like, get me as much information as you can and come back, and then we create a better plan, right? So then we go off and we look a lot deeper. So exactly what's happening, where is this coming from? Is this, on our database? What's going on? So what happened or is happening? The next thing is containment. So if something is actually still happening, you need to stop it as soon as possible. So short term, sometimes this means turning off your web app, which I know is ugly in the eyes of the business, but if something is actually actively happening, depending upon the service level agreement you have, sometimes that's the easiest thing. Sometimes you need to close certain responses or, put up a page that says, oh, we're doing maintenance for the next 10 minutes. If you can stop an attack partway through, congratulations, that's awesome. But if not, then you want to do containment long term. And sometimes it means bringing the app down. Sometimes it means taking some of the functionality offline for a little while you figure out what's going on. This will depend on your incident, but you definitely need to make sure that no more damage is done once you've found out what's going on. Next, you want to eradicate. So once you've stopped whatever is happening, you figure out what's happened. You need to make sure that there's no one living on your network. You need to make sure that no one has control over your app, that no one's created users in their own name so they can still come back and access things later. You need to make sure that the threat is eradicated. And then you want to do recovery. So you want to repair the systems, restore systems, repair damage, and you need to bring your business back online as fast as possible. If at all possible, undo every single thing that's been done. This will again depend on the specifics of the exact incident you're doing. And then lastly, so once everything seems to be okay and the business is going, once everyone's had time to go home and rest, you want to do a post-mortem. So we need to ensure we learn from our mistakes. I worked somewhere once, and this is how I launched my first AppSec program. We had a whole bunch of incidents over the course of a year, and we had a post-mortem after each one, and I ended up putting them into 5 different types of groups, and some of it was like, things that could not be avoided, but a whole bunch of them, I'd say around 30%, were application security related, and they're really simple things to fix. And when I explained, if we just give developers some tools and a little training, like none of these will happen anymore. And I explained how much it cost to manage those incidents and how much time it took and what the risk was. When I presented it, they're like, start now, right now. And that's how I launched my first AppSec program. So it's really, really important that you do a postmortem after every incident and that you learn from your mistakes. And one more thing, that you perform blameless postmortem is really, really, really important. That after an incident is over, that it's not Sarah or it's not Bob or Alice's fault. It's what safeguard wasn't there, what policy didn't exist, or what training did they not receive that allowed these things to happen. When we point fingers at specific people, they don't trust us anymore. They feel afraid to tell us when things are wrong. And like I figured out the hard way, it breaks trust, right? And it's really, really important that the rest of IT trusts the security team, especially in time of emergency. So please perform blameless postmortems. Whenever we have a giant outage, we like to publicly show all the things we've done. So if you're interested in seeing like why Azure went down and what lessons we've learned from things, we have a blog where we publish everything. I know that might sound weird, but it really helps us learn we hope that we're helping the industry. And also it just, I don't know how to explain, but it's getting stuff off your chest like that can be helpful. Okay, so conclusion. Application security is hard, but we got this. Sorry, I skipped ahead. If you prepare for incidents, if you do a whole bunch of step 1, you will not need to do very much step 2. When you prepare for things, you will find all sorts of things wrong, and hopefully you will fix them. And then you will end up with less incidents. And when you have an incident, you will be able to solve it in 14 minutes or some shorter period of time with less damage because you're ready. right? And I personally think that preparing for incidents is a very, 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 very valuable activity, and I wouldn't want to work somewhere if that's not the case, if they're not going to give me time to prepare for these things. And with that, I want to give you a few resources. So I was going to tell you if you have questions about specific things and just have links, but then I decided instead, if there's a thing like a product or something that I mentioned, you should search for it in your favorite search tool, and mine is DuckDuckGo, and learn more about it and train yourself. There's lots of free things online, and I can't go into every single topic, but I can give you a bunch of links about how to get started learning about application security. This is a blog post I wrote up with several different resources that are all free, and I'm going to keep adding to this over time. So either I learned AppSec from these resources or I built them because they didn't exist yet. So I am hoping that this blog post helps you. And then lastly, I'd like to kindly suggest that you follow me. I have a blog where I release all my security research, and then I have a show on Sundays where I stream myself doing various DevSecOps activities, and we have a lot of fun. And with that, I would like to invite all of you to... I see questions. Interesting. Your audio is looping. I'm here in hopes of hearing some Canadian accents. Yes.
Right, should I just type the questions? What's that?
Okay, so questions will be heard at the end.
I can just type them if it's easier. Who's got questions?
Let's see if anyone has any questions.
Just
So,
let me know, I'll
hi.
type it for
Hey,
you.
Takaharu. Hi, I hope you're well.
So I want to ask,
Okay, so if anyone has questions, now is the time to put it in here. And I'm going to check over here and see what's happening over here. I don't know how they do questions.
Let's change it.
okay,
I'm not exactly sure how they do questions on YouTube. But sorry, we fixed the problem.
is this working? Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see it. I see one. So I don't know. Okay, so.
Hello, does this work?
And we'll ask
There's a
on
bit
your
of delay,
behalf.
so
So
just
what if
one
the payload has PII? Oh, that's really tricky. I see your question menu. Generally, I try to keep the payload in the logs because I see all sorts of things happening on
Looks
the
like there's
screen
like a
there.
30-second delay.
I generally save the payload because it's important. And the payload is the attack. So that's what someone put into my web app to try to attack me. It's more what your app responds with that's more likely to have personal identifiable information. So when I say I want you to save the payload, that would be something like, single quote equals 1 equals 1, or something like that, as opposed to, Tanya Jacob, born on this day, blah, blah, blah. Right? So I don't know if that helps you, but if the payload does have personal identifiable information, that means that the attacker knew that. And either they got it from a previous attack that they did on your app, or they already knew it, which is disconcerting. So I'm going to look and see if there are any questions on Twitch. So ready for QA? We can try over YouTube stream, otherwise I'll post them here. Sounds good. Great, so let's see if there are any questions there, and I'm on Mixer. Hi, Takaharu. It's so nice to see you. I mean, even if I just see your username, it's great. Okay, so how does the IR process change when you are doing platform as a service and software as a service applications and you don't have access to the standard instant response investigation tools? So this is going to be an Azure biased answer because unfortunately I only, truly honestly, actually have significant experience with Azure. I don't know AWS very well and I don't know GCP very well. However, I suspect that they're similar because mostly we're all copying each other. If we're being honest, all the cloud providers are like, that's a great idea, we should do that too. So if you're using platform as a service, so to give you an example, devslop.co is running on an app service, which is a platform as a service. And then I can use application insights to see into it. I also can see everything in the security dashboard, which is called Azure Security Center. I can turn on threat protection and it sees when it's being attacked to a certain extent. And then on top of that, I can also create something called playbooks, which is an automated responses. So if something has happened previously to your app or an attack, you can recognize it and then create an automated response. You can have it run scripts or shut down the app. So you can script what you want to have happen. And that includes anything that you have the power to do in Azure. And you can get it to automatically respond when it sees similar activities. Can you post a link in your chat for getting started in AppSec? Absolutely. I'm going to post all of the links. So I'm going to do this. So I'm going to put it here. And I'm going to put it in here too. And here too. And then I'm going to put the other link as well. Okay, and back here, links for getting started in application security. Okay, awesome. Here, and here, and here. Awesome, thank you. And let's see, so does anyone have more questions? Sorry, we had a problem, fixed it. Questions here, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thanks for watching. I'm so excited people tuned in. Thank you, I really appreciate it. And yes, I'm sure you probably heard some pretty serious Canadian accent happening. I'm told my accent's really, really strong, and that I say a on the end of a lot of sentences, and that I say about instead of about, even though I don't think that's true. Enough people have told me I think it might be true. Okay, cool. Thank you so much. So I don't see any more questions, which is great. So I am going to turn this over to the YouTube channel so that we can see, does that no boot about it? Oh, I love it. Okay, so I don't see anything else happening on Mixer or Twitch. Good. Okay, so I'm going to let it come over here. So if you are on my channel, I am going to send you over to the YouTube channel so that rather than having latency, you can just go right over to them. So go, Takaharu, if you want to see the next speaker, should go to this link. So this is the link for you to go over and watch it live. And then I'm just going to be replaying what they're playing. So you might want to go to them. It's totally up to you. Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you coming here.
Sure, George, I guess you can, she hear me?
And I'm going to turn this so you can just go right over to them. So go, Takaharu, if you want to see the next speaker, to go to this link. So this is the link for you to go over and watch it live. And then I'm just going to be
Turn the volume
so you might want to go to them. It's totally up to you. Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you coming here.
There. Testing. Well, I don't know who's hearing me or not, but thanks very much to Tanya. I guess we could give her a round of applause. I'm not sure if you'll, but let's do it anyways. So yeah, first of all, thank you everyone for coming, and there is still some pizza left. We can grab it after. I think we'll just continue this since everyone's sitting here. We got the stream. Instead of giving a break, what do you guys think? Since we got the stream going, we'll keep going?
Up to you.
Okay. Yeah, because then it might be interruptive to the stream, so we'll just we'll keep it going.
I need to set up the mic as well, so.
Oh, okay. So maybe we'll take a 5-minute break.
5 minutes it is.
Okay, let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll continue with Siva's presentation. Thank you. All right, we're going to start the second segment of today's session. Our second speaker is Siva. Siva and I have worked at HSBC for a number of years. Siva is currently the head of security and fraud risk for commercial banking channels. He started off as a developer and has 18 years of experience in the security industry. He's been a pen tester, PCI QSA, and he's currently responsible for protecting mission-critical banking applications against cyber and fraud attacks. I know his job is really difficult. I've been there with him. So let's give a big round of applause. And take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so yeah, first I'll already give a little bit of a background of my background actually. So I'll just start expand a little bit on that, and then we'll go into the topic. So I, as you said, started off as a developer. I developed client server applications, like if you still remember it. And I then moved on to web applications, and then I found that I was actually even better at breaking things, and I moved into security testing, like testing and then security testing, and that went into penetration testing, I started a company as well, co-founded a company in California, just doing security consulting, primarily pen testing, web application security testing, and PCI consulting as well, over time. Did a lot of PCI and PADSS, payment card industry, the PCI DSS standard, as well as the payment applications, data security standard. And then I had enough of travel, doing consulting work, I decided I wanted to stay in one place, and I joined the company. So now I just want to mention something here. So this is not an officially my employer approved talk. So I'm going to basically say, hey, employer, you can easily find out who my employer is. It's not like a huge mystery. He's already mentioned it. But I'm going to use some of the context, but it's also going to be stuff that I've learned all around. Not just at this location. I'm going to keep it neutral, but I just wanted to, give that context, I'm not going to specifically mention, the employer, I'm not supposed to, right? Okay, so, the topic is, managing convenience security. So one of the things that, you'll normally see is the more, it's a function, right? So, more security means usually less functionality, or at least more friction. You are going to end up with lots of challenges, and then people keep or you tighten it so much that it's unusable. The only secure application or secure anything is basically if you don't build it at all, right? So you don't have it, then it's the best. You don't have any attacks on it because it doesn't exist. So one of the things that we are going to talk about, or rather the primary thing that we are going to be talking about with a lot of other associated things, would be how do you manage how do you reduce friction for users, but at the same time increase your security view into and also provide a secure application or a service. So I've already covered this. Pretty much I manage currently cybersecurity and fraud risk for commercial bank channels. So this is going to form the basis for what we are going to talk about. So the lens that I'm going to be talking about from is going to be based on commercial bank channel. And commercial bank channel is different from when you go into a website or when you go to a bank and then open an account. That's going to be retail. So the terminology that we're using: commercial banking, corporate banking, and retail. Retail will be what you personally would be using. Commercial banking would be what companies would be using. So company can, and when we talk about somewhere I have something somewhere here versus customer versus user. So when I say customer, it's basically, let's say a company, let's say Ping Identity, because we are here. Ping Identity would be a customer, and then the users would be the users that Ping identifies as authorized to use the application. So there's a distinction. When you do talk about retail banking, there is not that distinction. Is your customer is your user, and that is a very significant difference. That we will see why as we go along. There are lots of aspects of this, that will actually affect us. Because the primary reason is the masters that we serve are actually not the users. You know, like we serve, so corporates typically have more security controls. They have their own security shop inside, you know, and they require, they have policies, procedures, they have, you know, standards that everybody needs to meet. Unlike a retail customer, you know, like they don't really have any of these things. So, you know, they are, and retail customers typically are more, you know, tend more towards ease of use. Versus, even though in our case users want ease of use, you know, like our masters are primarily corporates, where, you know, like we actually have to cater to the needs, the security needs of the company that is actually our customer, right? So so the channel itself is like, you know, approximately 1 million users, spread over 54 countries. So it's a global application. It's not a, you know, like an in-country application. It's hosted, you know, like as a single instance, meaning like it's run from a single place, but, you know, like it's available in 54 countries, or, you know, 50 plus countries. It includes a lot of, you know, it's more like a platform, and so it includes a lot of other features. Lots of SSO applications running off of this as well. One of the new things that are coming up, you know, like new things that are coming up are open banking and PSD. You know, PSD, if anybody is aware, the European, you know, payment security, the Payment Services Directive, you know, that is being put out, actually comes into effect in September 2019 in Europe, and there's like a whole bunch of, you know, like, so all banks in Europe are supposed to expose their functionality through APIs, and any fintech can actually use that. So, you know, like if I can I can register a fintech, you know, like, or a company, and then say and there are some requirements for what that is, you know, like, so, and once I register that company, I can basically use the APIs provided by the banks to make, you know, like basically provide a user interface to the, you know, to the customers, and have them access the banking application through my application. Right, so they don't actually have to ever go, once they set it up, they don't ever have to go back to the bank anymore. They just go all the way through my application, right? So, or the fintech, or whatever, you know, like the company is, they typically called TPPs, third-party third-party payment providers. Or, you know, again, if you split it into AISP, account information service provider, so where you only do read-only, you just look at accounts, and then payment instruction service provider, PISP, where you can actually make payments as well. So there are lots of other stuff. Open banking is the UK initiative. You know, it's primarily for UK. You know, like, again, same thing, same concept. Open, you know, like you need to expose APIs. Banks need to expose APIs, and then customers can use it through other interfaces. So, you know, just to keep that in mind, right? So I don't know, you know, like how many people here work for, you know, a financial institution. So, you know, like financial institutions are typically regulated, heavily regulated. So we can't just do stuff because we want to do stuff. You know, like it has to meet regulatory requirements. So just because of the fact that, you know, we are, you know, like this platform is under, you know, is in 54 countries, we have to comply with, you know, like regulatory requirements in all these countries as well. So it's not an easy job, because sometimes the regulations actually can be contradictory as well. So, you know, it's basically a question of which regulator you want to piss off, you know, and you know, what you can afford to piss, you know, who you can afford to piss off. That's, you know, like sometimes what happens. So, you know, like just the main point I wanted to talk about is the customer versus user difference, which is, you know, our customers are actually companies, and then users will be the individual users working for those companies primarily. So, some of the formatting is actually gone. You know, I don't know, you know, probably the computer or operating system, whatever it is. So what do we want to do? What are we trying to do here, right? So one of the things, you know, like my goal, you know, like, or at least the goal for this, you know, the topic would be, you know, like identifying users, you know, like accurately, also identifying transactions accurately, and I'll talk about why, you know, why I include this. You know, when we talk about the attack vectors and stuff, you know, like I'll come to why that is important. Usually what happens is we are only primarily focused on, you know, like identifying the user once, you know, like at the beginning of the session, and then after that, you know, we don't, you know, like really, we assume that the session is valid as long as somebody gives us a token, which is basically a session ID, or it could be something else, you know, like a access token, some access token. So the bad would be, like what happens if it gets, like your application gets accessed by unauthorized users. So, they could bypass, and we will talk about how, that can happen, how, unauthorized users can access it. Most people already know this, but, we'll go through it again. Creation of unauthorized transactions, like could be the consequence of it. Like so if somebody, like if there is unauthorized access, somebody can actually create transactions, can actually just view information. That actually can cause lots of issues. There are, privacy regulations, like GDPR and all sorts of stuff where, like just loss of information itself is a problem. Like a bank, a nameless bank, just had to, submit to the California regulator that, like they, like unauthorized people accessed their customers' accounts, right? So, and because we are also heavily regulated, like we have to actually report everything, any breach, anything, like we have to report. The ugly would be, like the consequences of what these, like of these actions would be financial loss, reputation loss, and regulatory scrutiny. And regulatory scrutiny you don't want to have. You want to avoid as much as possible because, like once they get in, it's going to be really intrusive. And reputational hit, like obvious financial loss, obvious financial regulatory scrutiny can also result in extra financial loss because of the fact that, like they can actually fine you. And also, keep you, monitor you over time, and that actually can cost you money as well. And then you lose the ability to actually do things, like the freedom to actually do certain things, like so you'll have to do what they ask you to do, and you don't have a choice. And the deadline will suddenly shrink. Like they basically will give you, like less, flexibility in terms of, normally you could have basically say, hey, can I just comply with this a little later? Now, that's going to actually shrink, and, like the answers are probably going to be more no's than yeses, right? So you want to avoid that as much as possible. So typical authentication methods, right? So like we talk about, and I've just used a couple of them here, but they, like any access token, single sign federated access tokens, whatever it is, right? So primarily you're talking about username, password, like SCA. SCA is a PSD term, strong customer authentication, and strong customer authentication typically means you use multi-factor authentication, 2 out of 3, and 2 out of 3, the 3 would be possession, inherence, and knowledge. The knowledge would be your password, as an example. Inherence would be a biometrics, so like fingerprint, voice, like retina scan, heartbeat, whatever. And then your possession would be, like a secure token, or a, and like there is a reason, some people might recognize this, like there is a reason why I put this number, this calculator here. The platform that we support actually uses, a similar one, but it's not like the RSA token, it's like more like a for why you have a keypad. There is something called dynamic linking, which we'll talk about down the line as well. For transaction authentication, we use, you can actually enter data into this and then generate an OTP value based on the data that you enter. So that's why you have the, the calculator keyboard, right? So typically what you would have, like in any application, and one of the things that in normal best practice would be, like so you do re-authentication for sensitive operations, but you can also actually have, a higher level of authentication for sensitive operations. So low risk account is if I'm just to look at accounts, like I'm okay probably with just using, a username, password, or any access token. But if I want to make payments, and just to give you a, like a view of, like what the platforms that I'm talking about, like so billion-dollar payments, like can happen. So like there were like probably into last year there were probably over 650,000 payments over $1 million. So the scale, the amount that we are talking about is huge. For a retail banking platform, typically your maximum will be like 99999. Like just $1 less than 100,000. Like we do like 18 nines or something like that. It's like an unbelievable number. I've never even seen that number fully written out. It's like a so it's a huge number, some hundreds of trillions of dollars. So the values are huge. So you want to make sure that like you're not going to allow just access like to make $1 million payment even using a password and like just a user ID and a password. Then you want to use an enhanced authentication method. One would be OTP. It's transaction signing. Transaction signing would be you enter, let's say, some part of the the PSD actually requires you to enter the value, the amount into the device or as part of the generation of the OTP. So you need to enter that into the device, and then it generates a value based on the value that you enter, and then that you use in your application as an OTP value. The problem for us is for retail banking this is fine, but for us like if you are talking about $1 billion payment, by the time you enter the number of like the digits, you are probably lost track of it, and sometimes like some of they only display 8 characters. And the problem with that is we are already over 8 characters, which means once it scrolls, you don't know what you typed and where you are, and if it's like zeros consecutively, you're screwed. You're always going to make a mistake, right? So this is not going to work in a lot of cases. So what else can we do? How else can we for critical high value payments or risky operations? It could even be just user management, and the application need not even be a financial application. Let's say it's like an application that gives you access to the electrical grid, right? How do I ensure that I make sure that somebody I do enhanced authentication, and I also want to make sure that there is physical possession of that OTP device. Let's say you use a security token that keeps generating time-based OTP. So you have a time-based OTP and an event-based OTP. Event-based OTP is where you click something or enter something and then generate a OTP value. Time-based is like it just keeps generating every 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a new value, and then you enter it. So even though that is like slightly, higher, strength, you take the OTP, if somebody gets access to that time-based OTP device, and that basically means they possess the authentication token, and if they are able to get your password or credentials, the user ID password knowledge-based credential, then they are in. So what can we do, right? So we'll talk about some of the attack vectors and how these will relate to some of the things that we want to do down the line, right? So presentation of a credential is really not sufficient proof that the actual person is the one logging in. So I can basically steal your credentials. Now, how does it happen? Credential stuffing attacks. You have seen. Like 3-4 days ago, there was this article about 738 million email IDs and passwords that got dumped from somewhere. LinkedIn has been hit. Twitter has been hit. Facebook has been hit. So all these companies have been hit. Where somebody goes and grabs. Even if not just this particular attack. Lots of companies have actually lost credentials because they didn't store the credentials properly, user ID, password, they didn't hash the password properly, they didn't solve the passwords properly, which meant they were vulnerable to a brute force attack or a rainbow table attack. So some form or the other, stored credentials you are going to basically get access to, and then even if your application, like our application need not be even, hacked, or our infrastructure need not even be hacked. They go somewhere else, they steal the data, the credentials from somewhere else, and then try it on us, and if some user has used the same credential in that application and our application gets compromised as well, because an unauthorized access has taken place. Now we have to report unauthorized data exposure to the regulator, and then we probably will be under scrutiny as well for various other reasons. But so one of the things it could be that is basically credential stuffing. You steal information from other websites and then try it out on this website. Weak credentials. The credentials themselves may be weak. Sometimes they use weak passwords. They sometimes some of the applications may only allow 5 character, 4 character, whatever it is. So it may be vulnerable to brute force attacks. Phishing. So another form of attack would be phishing, and phishing actually leads to 2 different two different variations on the attack. First one would be, I can just pop up a window in a phishing attack to ask for credentials, and then you can provide the credentials, and then I use that in the application. So typically, when it basically started off as, popping up a screen that looked like your bank, and you think that, you're doing something, and then suddenly the screen pops up and then you enter it, and usually, like they send you emails, you click on a link and then it looks like your bank link, like you go in and you enter something and then, actually find out that, it's not really, they've stolen your credentials. The other way that happens is like, phishing emails could be spear phishing sent to a targeted person, or, like just a random spam email that actually you click on, installs malware on your device, and the malware on the device actually now does two different things, which is, one is it can actually intercept, it can basically run a proxy on your device. So let's say you run it, like you download, the malware gets downloaded on your computer. It can install keyloggers, it can install certificates in your trusted certificate store, and that has another complication, which is session hijacking, and I'll explain like how that can happen. So once malware comes on, it can basically pop up screens, just ask for credentials and people give credentials out. It could also be that it's just looking for specific sites that is targeting. We've seen examples, we've actually seen real life examples attacking our institution. Like, so if like we had the vendor re-engineer the code, look at it, and the reverse engineer code, look at it, and then there is like specific something.com. And there is like a bunch of somethings.com. They are targeting, they are writing code to target specific applications or sites. And what happens also is, so when you target it, like, so what they're looking for is like they're looking at any access to those sites, and then the moment that happens, they activate. Until then, they just remain silent. So and then they can one is they can pop up windows to actually capture credentials. The other one is like they just look at it, sit quietly underneath, and then capture the credentials. The other thing we have seen, like on our side is like, like the malware actually pops up a screen when we do, multi-factor authentication with OTP. It actually asks for, instructs the user to actually press this button to do this, because they have already analyzed the, the banking software and the operational procedures that go with it. So they actually instruct the user to say, what, do this, click on this button to actually generate the code, put this in, enter this, and then they think that users thinks that it looks like exactly the same application. They basically skin it, and you can actually and the customers enter the data, and then that basically gets proxied back to, so the attacker will have a separate session, the user will have a separate session here, and then once you enter the credentials or whatever, the malware will basically say, please wait, and then it will do the operation on the back end. Or you can basically say, what, the application is not working, try again later. And so you are basically sitting back while the guy is actually now taking over your credentials and then reposting them, and then now having a session open in your name. From an application owner point of view, how do we know? Because all we know is like if somebody presented credentials that were valid, so user ID, password, or OTP value that actually matched, which makes it like perfectly valid login from my side, and we just basically start allowing you to do transactions or whatever, account information, whatever it is you want to do. Session hijacking, slightly like variation, like which is how does it happen? So your question might be, does the website not have HTTPS? Will the certificate not, pop up as invalid? Because I'm doing a proxy in between. If anybody's used Burp Suite or any other interception, like a testing tool, you will see that, like when you run it, like it'll actually pop up, like a window, because of the fact that, the browser to the proxy server is one session, and then the proxy server to the server is another session, and the browser only sees this proxy server's certificate, not the server's certificate. But I can actually, if I have access to the box, access to the computer, the user's computer, I can actually install a certificate on the device, regardless of it's mobile or like it's a computer. I can install a certificate on the device, and I can now like there is no warning anymore, right? So that is, and again, like the session token, the session is basically primarily dependent on the session token. So as long as as long as I present a valid session token, like I am logged in. So you can log in, and I can basically capture your session, and I can start replaying it. The application has no clue, right? So some applications basically look for source IPs and stuff, but again, like based on, again, how many applications really do that? So the only thing is like, as long as somebody presents a valid token, I'm good. Social engineering. So one of the suggestions that were made, that was made, at least I researched a lot of this on, one of the suggestions was YubiKey. So can we use YubiKey? So there was like bunch of articles that came out recently, like a couple of months ago, where they said, oh, Google has done a lot of research on this and they have come up with this, and their attack rate has gone down drastically. The problem for us is, we are not dealing with Google engineers, knowing what to do, what to press, what not to press. We are talking about customers who have no clue a lot of the times about technology. They are just worried about, making payments. They are worried about, using the application, and they don't know about the, how, when to press, the YubiKeys button to authorize a transaction or not. We actually had a smart card, so you actually have a smart card reader attached to your computer. You put in a smart card and you put in a PIN, and then you actually authorize transactions or log in or whatever. And social engineering, I just call and say, what, hey, I see a problem, whatever, you need to put that in, put that in, they'll put that in, they'll listen to the attacker more than they listen to us, right? So again, it's all skill, how can I convince you to do something that I want you to do, right? And with the right hooks, people who actually do it. So YubiKey for us, really not, and it's also expensive. I can't, for a million users, if I start sending out in 54 countries, by the way, regulation, we talked about regulation earlier. China has a cybersecurity requirement where they say that they have to use their encryption algorithm and their locally manufactured encryption chip, or the chip that is used in an OTP token. So we actually had to create one just for them. And why? I don't know. So I have some ideas on why, but that's they want it done that way. And if you want to do business there, you have to follow their rules, and that's the only way to do it, right? So and it's logistically it's a crazy it's a pain, right? So you want to avoid as many devices and extra that we'll actually end up paying for. You want to do that, and also if something happens, the battery dies out, and then they call help desk, so you actually have additional costs to it, in terms of support. So these are different. Any questions up to this point? I just wanted to make sure I just don't keep running. I want to. You feel free to raise your hand, whatever, so I can spot you. Ask any questions at any point of time. So drawbacks, we already talked about some of the stuff, depends on the presentation of valid credentials. It's a very rigid authentication journey. So one of the things that you'll end up doing is for us, at least in one of the platforms, if you make a payment, regardless of whether it's a $5 payment or $1 million payment, you have to do OTP. There is no other option. You can write rules within your application to say, what, over this amount, do OTP, or over this amount do some other form of authentication or extra form of authentication. But it's still rigid. You have a very rigid structure of user journey for how when authentication is going to kick in, what is going to happen. And again, you're limited by the number of authentication methods that you can put in. Does not adapt to application usage risk. What are we talking about? We're talking about the existing legacy authentication mechanisms. It does not. So why? So if let's say I'm making payments to Farshad, I don't say Farshad. Okay, so I'll take Steven here. So I make payments to Steven every month. For he's blackmailing me for whatever, right? So so I make regular payments to him. So in this particular case, so if I'm just going to make a payment to Steven and I see, you see that, I've been making these payments for last 2 years. Why is that? Is that a risky behavior? It's a known behavior, but the application is not going to bother about it. It's still going to ask you for extra authentication because it's not intelligent enough to actually see that this is a pattern that that is valid and nobody has complained about it. So it is okay. So it's still going to add that extra friction of adding that extra authentication for making a payment, which depending on what your application does. So some of the other things that we can start talking about. This is going to be a primary, this is the the crux of our talk right now. So I'm going to be talking about the different aspects of how we do it. What are the different kinds of authentication, and then we are going to tie them all in towards, how they can all be combined to come up with a, a better authentication system or a continuous authentication system. So device context. So what is device context? So simplest device context would be your device fingerprint. So device fingerprint, So device context can be like also, you know, like whether it's a, you know, like if it's you're talking about a mobile device, you know, you can be jailbroken, rooted, you know, what device you are using, you know, is it like a laptop, you know, is it like a Android device, iOS device? Device fingerprinting will also include a lot of other stuff, which is, you know, what's your screen resolution, is there a device ID that is provided by the device itself, like mobile devices do. It can also be, you know, so it typically will look at time zone, screen resolution, fonts that you have put in the software on the device, any updates, versions, you know, like of the updates, you know, software running on top of, you know, like the OS level. And all those other things, right? It also can use, you know, IPs, IP addresses, you know, like, and locations. It could be, you know, like geolocation, you know, from a mobile device. So this would all be device fingerprint. So one of the reason I actually highlighted that device fingerprint was to, you know, like a reminder for me to talk about this. When we did, you know, when we evaluated vendors for device fingerprinting is not simple as like, you know, just generate a unique hash for, you know, like take a bunch of stuff and generate a unique hash. There is an algorithm to it, you know, like a lot of companies actually, that is their bread and butter, you know, like, so we don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we just go with the vendor. One of the things that we found out was, and Alex over there in the back, you know, like was the guy that actually crunched the numbers. One of the things that we found was a lot of these vendors, you know, like claim, you know, high percentage, you know, like, so you have two, you know, like two measuring units that you would look at. One would be collision, the other one would be persistence. So like, you know, like, so for example, if you remove a font, your device fingerprint will change. So that basically means less persistence, right? So how long does a device fingerprint stay on as the same? And the collision would be how many people have the same device ID. So one of the things that, you know, like, so, you know, Stephen and I may have the same device ID, even though we are in completely different geographical locations. What you want is like low collision, which means you need to have unique devices, and high persistence, which means this device fingerprint should stay the same over a long period of time, which is how, you know, you can actually make sure that, you know, the device is unique, and, you know, you can map the device to the user, right? So one of the things that we found when we did POCs with vendors was everybody claimed, you know, like their product was the best, you know, they can come up with like, you know, 99.999 reliability, whatever, right? We found out that, you know, like our situation was unique. This is where the difference between corporate and retail comes into play. Corporate, you know, like, so when you go to a company, your company probably has like, you know, images that you roll out onto PCs. So, you know, a lot of the pieces that you buy in bulk as well. So, you know, you have the same PC, same resolution, same, you know, software versions, same patches and everything else. And suddenly your collisions are suddenly increasing because all the attributes that they're looking for are pretty much the same. You know, across multiple devices, and it's all within the same IP address, because if you're all going through the same gateway out to the internet from your location, and I have like, you know, 10 people from here making payments on my system, all of you are probably going to have like very close device IDs. There is going to be at least a few collisions. How do I now uniquely identify? So this is a problem that we had to, you know, overcome, where, you know, and this is where most of the vendors failed, you know, like, so we had to actually figure out a vendor that actually worked, you know, like where their rate was really, really high. So, you know, just a pointer for you guys, you know, if you are looking at it, you know, like make sure that you actually do a POC and look at statistics on, you know, like how effective they are, you know, before you actually, you know, go with them. So IP address location, you know, again, you know, IP addresses, you know, the last mile problem, you know, like, so you don't know exactly, you know, like where they are, you know, so you can go country, you can go, you know, city, you can go region. Actually, it gives you a lot of, if you do geolocation through IP addresses, it can give you a lot of information, but the more you drill down, the more inaccurate they become sometimes, right? So, you know, it's not always the case, but a lot of times they, you know, like the accuracy falls as you go down and down, you know, like to the street level, you know, your accuracy is almost, you know, like off, you know, way off. So you need to, you know, keep that in mind when you're looking at IP address location. However, you know, like it is a good indicator for some cases, which we'll talk about down the line. Behavioral biometrics. So behavioral biometrics is another method that is like very common now. You know, like so a lot of vendors are actually coming out with it. So what they do look for is like, you know, typing cadence. So how fast you type. So when I type something, like I type should, I always type SHOUDL, and then I correct it, and then I do that correction every time, every single time, literally. So that's a unique fingerprint for me. So there are lots of like mistakes that people constantly do, and those will become your fingerprint. Right, so as a unique identifier for you, how you hold the device. So if you're left-handed, right-handed, like, and how hard you type, like on a mobile device, for example. So how quickly do you move your mouse over the, like over the screen. So if you are very familiar with the application, you go tuck 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 tuck. Not, like you're probably going to, like look for stuff, you're going to be slow. And you also have heat maps, like, so, everybody knows heat maps. So, like you'll see, where people go the most, and each person has a unique signature or a unique pattern for, doing stuff on the screen. So all those they will learn, and then that becomes your fingerprint. So that becomes your unique ID. Okay, so the other thing that we talk about, I think, there is a little bit of stuff missing, I guess. Okay, so other thing that we can talk about is user behavior. So one of the things that we can normally we can look at, is other than the biometric stuff, is what is your normal, right? So we'll talk about normal down the line, but like, so you will normally make payments of let's say 100,000 to 200,000, or like in a retail banking scenario, you're probably going to look at like let's say $100 to $500 normally. Most of your transactions are going to be in that range. So who do you make payments to normally? So you're probably going to make payments to your bills, like your electricity company, your cable company, blah blah blah, right? So those are, or like a couple of friends, like like I'm paying blackmail to Steven, like, so I keep making those $100 payments or whatever it is that I make. So that could be your like known beneficiaries, right? Time of day. So in our situation, this is also different. In our situation, most people come to work. In a corporate scenario, people come to work, and because they are operating on company accounts, they come to work, and then it's like usually a 9 to 5 or like whatever time zone, whatever time they normally work in. So if you see anything like we'll talk about anomaly detection a little bit, but like, so these are things that we normally see. So one of the things that you will do is like if you're our customers, our users normally make like they come into work, let's say 100 payments a day. So they come in, they know exactly what the position is, like they go in, they make a payment, they go out. So your user journey can also be your unique identifier. It's not going to be 100% unique. It's a reliable, it can be a reliable indicator depending on what you're looking for. So one of the things that we have seen, like is that, like some of the fraudster sessions are usually longer. The session, the interval itself is longer than normal users. So that could be actually, like informing you on your risk as well. So these are different things that you can look for, that you don't actually have to ask the user to do anything. It's all, you're looking at existing information. You're not looking at new information. You're not asking the user to enter anything. So this is basically less friction for the user, and you're also going to ask for extra authentication or whatever, depending on the risk, like the risk that you see for a particular activity. That's where like the continuous and the adaptive authentication, or yes, go ahead.
So first of all, are there tools that you know of to obfuscate the behavioral biometrics?
The simplest tool would be disable JavaScript. Sorry.
Having questions from the audience, please ask for a microphone so our people who are watching could also hear the question.
Yeah. So the question was, I'll just repeat this question here. So is there a way to actually disable behavioral biometrics, like, or at least obfuscate behavioral biometrics? Can happen, like, so the easiest way would be to just disable JavaScript. However, like a lot of applications, including Google just recently, requires you to enable JavaScript to actually work, like for you to use the service. So that would be one way of doing it, like, so the other way, so there are, so I don't want to go into too much detail in terms of, like how to attack. So this is not a course, and this is not a, like a talk on how to attack behavioral biometrics. So like, yes, it can be done. So I could replay. So again, does the vendor that you use have replay protection? So there is like a lot of other things that you need to look for when you look for, look at a vendor, or if you are going to develop it yourself as well. So the answer is yes, like to the question in some cases, but I can choose to just say, what, I'm not going to allow, like if you're, if you disable JavaScript, I'm not going to allow you to use the application. And nowadays, like more and more applications actually require JavaScript to do, like because everything happens on the screen, right? Like, so it's all the magic happens with like very little, back-end interaction. Okay, so let's move on. Yes, go ahead.
So, with regards to the anomaly detection, I know you haven't spoken to that yet,
Yeah.
but, you know, you're talking about the user behavior, so it's New Year's Day and they've got a hangover, or it's the day after their birthday. What type of elasticity do you have or allow for to not have the, have
Yeah, I
triggers
understand.
occur?
So this is something that you have to consider. Again, it depends on the elasticity that going to depend on your use case. You know, so the more critical the use case, you know, like, or more sensitive the use case, the less elasticity you want to, you know, like, allow. A lot of the, so again, you know, like, so this is, like I said, you know, like, this is just one method of authentication that you want to use. So you don't want to depend on this 100%. So what happens? So anomaly, right? So we talk about anomaly detection down the line. What if this is an anomaly? Let's say you're hungover and you're not, you know, like, you're not doing the things the way you normally do. So this is going to be an anomaly. So how do you account for this in your application? So your vendor, you know, like, or whatever, you know, if you use a vendor, you know, like, that algorithm itself should have, you know, allowed for something, but then even if that comes up as a you know, like, not matching, you know, the pattern, what do you do about it is something that you need to come up with for, as a use case for, you know, that would be an anomaly. So we'll talk about risk weighting anomalies down the line. So let's just move on and then we will cover that in just a minute. So there are a few other things that we can actually do as well. So configuration risk score is something, you know, like, you mentioned something. Wow, you know, like, did I run through really quick? Oh, okay. 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 So configuration risk score is something that, you know, like, we talk about, you know, like, in terms of how the application itself is configured for the user. So let's say, you know, in our platform we have dual control. You know, so dual control meaning maker checker controls. So, you know, like, even other applications can have it. Doesn't have to be a financial application. When you create a user, somebody else has to come and authorize the user. It could be like a payment approval, you know, like a expense approval application. Somebody creates it, somebody comes and approves it. So the more controls you have, you know, you can actually, and if the user is set up for those, you can actually reduce your risk level or at least weight the risk, you know, like, appropriately. So if I have dual control and if I have set up limits, so for example, you know, on our platforms we allow, you know, people, users and customers to be set limits. So you as a person cannot make more than like $1 million payment, or, you know, let's say $100,000 payment, but the other user can actually make, you know, up to $1 million or even $10 million. So, you know, if you have set up limits, you know, for individual users according to your risk appetite, you can actually address that, you know, include that as part of your risk scoring, you know, like, for authentication. Okay, so if you are using a jailbroken rooted device, you know, like, so if you, and, you know, there are again tools to check for a jailbroken rooted device, which we use a vendor that actually reports into it. It looks at the, when you start the application, it looks for, you know, like, whether it's jailbroken rooted, and then reports to us, and then we use that, you know, we can use that as part of our decisioning system. So inherently risky behavior, you know, like, using a jailbroken rooted device means that you have bypassed protections on the device, and that can actually, you can increase your risk score proportionately depending on how you see it and what kind of operations you perform. Fraud intelligence is another thing that, you know, like, I think Tanya also mentioned this, you know, Twitter, you know, like, and breach or whatever, right? So this is something that, you know, like, larger companies have, you know, we have it, where, you know, like, people look at, you know, go on the dark web, look at, you know, like, anything that actually talks about anybody that's talking about, you know, like, attacking the company, or, you know, like, exchanging exploits, you know, or credentials or whatever, and then that gets reported down to the security teams, and then we basically, you know, take action in terms of, you know, if it's a vulnerability that, you know, we are not aware of, you know, we try to fix it before anything can happen, or at least put, you know, like she was talking about WAF as a you know, intermediate control or an immediate control that you can put in place, kind of thing. We don't actually, you know, like, do it that way. However, you can handle it, right? So this can be discussions about sharing, like weaknesses, like sharing, credentials and stuff like that, like you want to look at, you can also use that. So one of the things that I would talk about, the way I would do this would be, if I see that there is a, like there is a imminent attack or an indication of attack or a discussion around attacks against a platform, I would basically increase my risk threshold or my risk threshold, or rather lower my risk threshold, which means more users will probably have to go through extra authentication steps, at least for a time period, and that basically protects me for a while, right? So while that that threat goes away. So there are things that you can do with fraud as well. So the next thing, so we want to talk about is anomaly detection. So what you need is a normal. So what you need to do is identify what is normal for a user. So let's say I make payments to like Steven, like every month $100 or whatever, $1,000, and that would my normal. And when do I make the payments? Like time of day, behavioral biometrics, like in terms of I log in, like, and this is the way I type. And also transactional value range, so it's like I always make payments to Steven on during this time or in this date range. Also from IPs, where are my IP locations? Like so, if I'm always logged in from Vancouver into the application, and suddenly you see the anomaly would be if I suddenly travel to New York or somewhere else and then started using the application, that would be an anomaly that you would flag, and you weight the risk score and then flag. So you also have to have a threshold, like so let's say like every like time of day, like that would be like if there is an anomaly, you basically flag it at like 10 units. And then if behavioral biometrics that you raised a question on, you raise that to, like, let's say you assign another 10, a value of 10 to it. So if that is an anomaly, let's say that scores 0 now, because like you cannot rely on it anymore because or it's false. So you cannot just look at that alone as an individual piece, because you are now looking at it as in a holistic way with other things. So is the time of day okay? Is the location okay? Are you making a payment to a like a known beneficiary that you have already made lots of payments to? So usually fraud will happen with like new beneficiaries. So like I'm trying to divert funds to a new person. So that, or to the fraudster, right? So if or if you're making a bill pay, like your electric company, right? If you're making a bill pay to the electric company, you can always get the money back, even if you make a mistaken payment. I've done that multiple times. I always select the first one, or I don't actually select anything. I just make a payment, and then I realize that like it's always defaulting to the first, like BC Hydro, because it starts with B, and then like I was actually $1,000 in credit, like with them, because I didn't actually look at the confirmation page. I just kept making payments, and then all the other guys started complaining. Hey, like they were sending me notices to cut my connection, whatever, right? So I had to call them and like say, okay, get the money back, send the money back in here. So would be a normal. So anything that is anomalous to this, like I'm just using some examples here. So like so some of the authentication points as examples, but anything that is anomaly would be flagged and then weighted, and then that would be once it reaches a threshold. So let's say like each one is assigned like 10, and then in here we have 5, let's say, and then like your score is 50, or like let's say anything over 50 is going to be you can choose to do a lot of things. You can basically say, what, I'm going to kick you out of the session. I don't like a lot of things I'm seeing here. Or I can say, what, I'm going to limit your payment values. So like so let's say your normal limit is like 100,000. I'm going to limit you to $10,000. So, and that can be dynamic. It doesn't actually have to be set up somewhere. You just have to so based on the policy, we'll talk about policy engine down the line, but like based on all these things that we see, I can at runtime, without actually having any like hard coding anywhere, I can actually reduce the limit to a value that I'm comfortable with. Like so if I have to pay out, let's say if it turns out to be fraud, and I have to pay you back, reimburse the customer, I don't want to reimburse $100,000. I would rather reimburse just the $10,000, but at the same time, I'm not blocking you from making payments. I'm actually allowing you, so less friction. I'm actually allowing you to make payments, except that now like you have a reduced functionality. I think Tanya mentioned earlier as well, reducing functionality. So you can reduce functionality without actually blocking functionality. So that would be your, like so, and the key is going to be creating the profile, right? So like I just talked about this as well. So every anomaly gets a weighted score. The key here is like, constantly fine tuning. And one of the things, I don't know if everybody has heard about this, which is the Microsoft chatbot basically got, trained to, spew profanity constantly, right? So, this is where, you got to be very careful about, training. And a lot of times, attackers, it's a cat and mouse game, constant cat and mouse game, where, somebody is actually trying to, bypass your controls, and you're trying to put in more controls to, overcome their attacks. And at the same time, you're also trying to make sure that, there is, not too much friction for the customer, and you want the customers to use your application. Again, you don't want to make it the more secure by just basically blocking off all functionality. Go ahead. Sorry, get them.
Implementing some sort of objective mechanism, like the system itself can be biased, right, based on these normals, right? So have you ever considered implementing some sort of third-party, like Oracle-based service?
So, so I don't want to get into vendor specific, when you say Oracle.
Oracle is an entity that's tied to the real world, that's using that as metrics to provide information to other systems, so it has less of a bias.
Okay, so you're basically talking about, I wouldn't, so this is the thing, right? So I don't want to, build anything on my own, I typically tend to use actually vendor products to actually do this. And you want to make sure that, you don't want to bias it, but at the same time, you also, we in our platform, we actually know more about the customer and how the customers use it than a third party. So you want to, it's up to you, at that point, but, you know your customer best. You know your patterns of the customer best, what they use, how they use it, and I would suggest that you use that. But if you look at, behavioral biometrics as an example, they probably have better models of, how, after a hangover, what is the tolerance limit for a, the user to, type, the typing speed cadence and everything else. I don't want to reinvent the wheel, exactly the point. So in those cases, I would actually use the vendor's, product to actually, provide that tolerance, but then from a platform specific, user behavior perspective, I would use my model, right? So you are not going to, you don't want to depend completely on vendors, you don't want to depend completely on yours as well. So you want to have a mix of both. Right. So one of the other things that we see is like distraction attacks. So so when there is a so typically there's a brute force attack or a DDoS on our platform when they are attempting fraud or trying to impersonate another user, trying to do a credential stuffing attack or trying to take over an account and then impersonate the actual user. So you want to look for so one of the things with the threshold would be, I talked about this already, which is if I have a 50 as the normal as the threshold, if I see that there is a DDoS attack happening on our network, I can basically lower the threshold to, or rather I can, in this case, raise it. So that means you have to pass 60 to be able to, get in, right? So I can do, I have the flexibility of adding, adjusting the threshold up or down depending on in the situation. So I call this situational awareness, right? So you want to see, you want to fine tune your system based on what the situation that is happening around you. So two key components that are required. One would be the policy engine. The policy engine is basically going to apply the rules, right? So for example, I want to say, if you see this, if the payment value is like this, or if the behavioral biometrics is like not checking out, what do you want to do? And that is going to be your policy engine that is going to apply that rule. Okay, so I'm going to ask for a second factor authentication or a different factor authentication, or step the user up from, like, maybe the user just logged in with a user ID and password. Now I want to actually do a push notification to to their mobile device to actually have them authenticate and approve a transaction, or even just get re-authenticated. So that is going to be your policy, engine, and that is going to require input from all the sensors on the current risk and the values that you see, to come in. It also maintains authentication state, which is so you logged in at as a user ID password user, and now that is going to maintain that. And if you now need to, if you do a sensitive operation, it's going to step you up, or just do a second factor authentication, and that it needs to know, because you don't want to keep for every operation. Like let's say you do one payment and then it steps you up, and then next payment it doesn't need to step you up again. If it can maintain that state, if you just stepped up, you just did push authentication, you just authenticated to the system that it was you, and as long as no other parameter changes, I can still retain that same authentication level and use the previous authentication level to actually let you perform the next operation. So that again goes towards less friction. So yes, there is an increased one level of friction that goes up, but then you can just maintain that at that point. You don't have to keep, for every operation you don't have to keep authenticating the user. The profile engine, which is what we talked about just now, which is the how do you keep your normal current. So how long do you look at, for example, if I looked at like 3 years worth of data for a corporate, the business could have grown, the number of users could have expanded, the users could have gone away. So like how do I know that, how do I keep that normal current? So you want to look at like somewhere between 3 to 6 months of data, for a particular user, and the key is going to be accessing that information real time. As users interact with your application, you need to actually be able to pull up that information and get the risk score really quickly for you to apply the policy that you have in the policy engine, right? So, and the bad normal, we talked about the chatbot, which is like, you can actually have, like attackers do this all the time. Go ahead. Sorry, I think you need the microphone.
ID instead of like location IP.
So it depends, right? So depending on what you do, how you do. So the device ID typically are going to be run from a browser. So it's all going to be in anything that is available within the browser is all you're going to get primarily, at least for us, like in our case, it's going to be like, primarily desktop application. So you're going to basically have anything that is available within a browser. It's not a thick client, it's basically a thin client. With mobile devices, you may actually have access to some of the extra information. Yes, then you will use it. So the vendors, you need to check with the vendors, when you do your POCs or, when you're talking to them, depending on which device or which, media, channel you're going to be using, you want to check what are all the, what they use. They're not going to ever tell you everything that they are going to use, because that's their secret sauce. They're not going to tell you, but at least you can ask them, specific questions, and they will usually answer you. So yeah, hope that answers your question, right? Okay.
So are you regionalizing that data? You talked about 54 different countries, so I/O is a huge issue here with. Sorry, are you regionalizing the data because you got 54 different countries, so I/O is a massive issue here, latency is a massive issue here with regards to the user experience. If it's got to query the AI engine or whatever the hell you're calling it, you need to regionalize that.
So
data.
this is a problem that you need to solve. So how do you get, and that is something that is like very critical. So like again, for us it's like different. It's not going to be 54 countries all logged on at the same time, because it's time zones. So you have like like up and down, so you're at the most like in a single time zone or a couple of time zones overlapping are going to be using it. So you're not going to have all the users logged in all at the same time. So you do have that cadence, like that you can actually work with. So it's also like how you cache, where you cache. So I'm not going to go into the technical details. This topic is not about the technical details of how you actually implement it. It's basically the concepts of using continuous and adaptive authentication to actually reduce friction for customers and also increase security, right? So we can have that discussion. That's a separate, altogether separate discussion. How you cache the information, how do you pull that? Like how do you, the normal needs to be constantly pulled. How do you keep that, right? So again, like you're not going to be, so you're not, yeah. So we address it, like in a specific way, where we actually have agreements with, individual countries to, locate it in certain places. So there are ways to deal with that as well. But yeah, I mean that's not the, like that's a different conversation. Just handling regulatory issues is a completely, like a day, probably more, like topic, right? So again, like coming to the close of like the talk. Basically, I'm open to questions, like probably at this point, but I'm gonna just talk about like there are different forms of authentication. So it's not about like using fingerprint or voice or heartbeat or retina or whatever. It is how you bring them seamlessly together with less friction for the user, but at the same time increasing security. So what happened? Sorry? Oh, TV went to sleep. Okay, anyway, I think we are kind of close. Anyways, just like 4 or 5 points that I want to make before I close. Sorry? Yeah, it basically said, keep your mouth shut now, stop, right? So that's okay. So understand the risks. So like I was talking about it from a corporate banking, like financial institution point of view. Your situation might be completely different, but at least like the concept you should be able to take and adapt to your needs. The risks you may have are different probably. If you are using health information, is going to be different. You have different set of requirements, regulatory requirements, privacy requirements that need to be met. Also, the sensitivity of data is slightly different. So you want to address those like in your way. Again, do not assume that somebody supplying a valid credential is actually the valid user. May not be. Check, so when you say continuous authentication, you're not checking in every page, because that's going to cause the problem of, like, so how many times do you go and check, the authenticity of the user? You want to do it at least in, just before sensitive operations, you perform sensitive operations, you want to check, the authenticity. And then keep normal profiles current. So again, that takes a lot of effort and background effort, but that is something that is very critical, because if your normal is not okay, you are not going to detect anomalies, because everything is going to basically get screwed up. And then so this is one more big issue that normally people don't talk about, which is people get used to doing certain things certain ways. So if I expect a pop-up, extra pop-up, like on this particular page, I'm looking for it. Like even subconsciously, I'm looking for it. And with adaptive authentication, in some cases, what can happen is you can pop up windows, authentication challenges in unexpected places, depending on what they are trying to do. What can end up happening is, we have seen this. I talked about this a little bit, at the beginning. Users, when they are presented with a malicious actor popping up a window, they'll answer the question. So what you may be doing with your adaptive authentication is that you can actually be habituating the user to respond to a challenge quickly, without thinking much. So you want to be careful about how you need to use this judicially. You can't just randomly start throwing authentication challenges everywhere. But you want to, and you don't want to, you want to keep the user journey as consistent as possible. So you want to, do it in sensitive places that you want to, authenticate the user before you, perform an operation. So that would be, the end of it. So, the TV's already went off. So I'll close. Any questions? Open to questions now. Yes.
How do you quantify the value of the work that you do in terms of like the risk reduction? So like, I mean, are you really able to, the number of transactions that you must process is unfathomable, but like to say like breach is avoided, for example, to support that investment in the work that you do?
So you have current state, or you basically have your previous state, which is like, you didn't have this, like how many, instances of fraud and why those frauds happen, or, unauthorized access. It could just be unauthorized, doesn't have to involve payments at all, just unauthorized access. Why did that happen? How did that happen? It could be like, we track whether it was through social engineering, whether it was through malware on the device, whether it was through, phishing attack. So we track all those things, and then we can basically see. So I didn't go into, like malware. So I didn't go into too much detail about malware. So one of the things that we actually do is like also look for malware on the browser. So when you see that, and you see that, like the user, you automatically reduce the thresholds, like you can actually, those activities where you apply a policy engine, apply the policy through a policy engine, you can actually audit that. Like, so every time, like you reduce the threshold, or every time you basically block access, or every time you ask for enhanced authentication, you can actually audit those, and you can then go back and review why that happened, that extra step or whatever you did, the action happened, and then you can use that to fine-tune your model, as well as you can use that to justify why you did what you did. Go ahead. Anything else?
Mike, for anyone who needs it.
Okay.
Okay, if there are no questions, let's give Siva a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Siva. I'd like to thank our speakers, Tanya and Siva, for their presentations and valuable insights. Tonight, I'd like to thank George and Fred and Jivan and all the volunteers for making this happen and for all your time. Really appreciate it. I'd like to thank our host, Ping Identity, for hosting this and all the pizza and everything else. Thank you. Big round of applause. Pizza was great. Thank you. Couple of other announcements. B-Sides, I'm a part of that. I organize that as well, and so is Mark. It's happening this year, March 18 and 19. CFPs close, I guess, this Saturday or before midnight or something like that, around 25th midnight. So send them in. Highly encourage you guys to, either send a CFP or volunteer your time. It's all for a good cause. The next OWASP meetup is on March 28th. We haven't announced the speaker yet. We have a couple of ideas lined up. Highly encourage you guys, to get up and speak. This helps everybody. So if some people think, I don't know, it's difficult, it has to be really polished. Hey, you know what? We all started somewhere. This is a great forum for you to get started and help give back to the community in terms of what you've learned. If any of you are looking for application security jobs, my company's hiring. Come talk to me. And there's also a mentorship program for experienced software developers to turn them into AppSec people. So come talk to me about that as well. And thanks again. And hopefully we'll see you at B-Sides or the next OWASP chapter. Thank you.